a man accidentally fell into a vampire's lair. On the brink of death, the vampire queen, moved by compassion, approached him, slit her own hand, and let her blood pour into his mouth. As the blood entered, his body was completely remade in a horrifying, aberrant evolution, giving birth to the first vampire with human blood who feared no sunlight. He then led an army of vampires to assault a family living in a lonely, desolate region. The mother, seeing the threat, shoved the dining table aside, lifted an old rug, and opened a long, dusty door to a basement below. She hurriedly hid her daughter inside, while she and her husband stayed outside without hesitation, warning their child never to emerge. The moment the wooden door shut, fierce sounds of battle filled the house. Soon they faded, replaced by the parents' heart-rending screams. Sadly, the daughter was still discovered, and the entire family of 3 perished. Since ancient times, the races of humans and demons have been like water and fire, irreconcilable. Vampires possess powerful bodies, astonishing speed, and can glide through darkness like silent specters, yet they have one fatal weakness: fear of sunlight. For thousands of years, war between the 2 races has never ceased, from early clashes with cold weapons to later firefights with guns, and finally to the stage where both sides deployed nuclear arms. Even then they remained evenly matched, neither yielding, and Earth was left a desolate, ruined wasteland. The ground everywhere was a scene of chaos. Residual nuclear radiation spread across the land. The remaining survivors, standing on the brink of extinction in their struggle to live, had no choice but to huddle within a holy city ruled with an iron fist by the church. The church had trained an order of exorcist priests, specialized in dealing with vampires. Each of them bore a cross engraved on their forehead. They possessed exceptional martial prowess, capable of taking on hundreds of enemies alone, as if in an empty battlefield. Their physical abilities far surpassed even those of vampires, rendering the latter completely powerless. Vampires were slaughtered by the exorcist priests to the point of near extinction. Thanks to this, humanity finally won the prolonged war. The few surviving vampires were exiled to remote reserves and kept under strict surveillance. After the war ended, the world order changed dramatically. The church, having gained immense influence through the war, gradually rose to become the central power of this new world. However, over time, they began to harbor resentment toward the exorcist priests, fearing that their strength might threaten the church's authority. As a result, the church not only disbanded the once glorious exorcist army, but also carried out a series of oppressive measures against them. The heroes who had once saved the world were slandered, branded heretics, and even had their freedom of movement restricted. These warriors, once admired by all, became social outcasts, shunned like rats scurrying through the streets. When they walked in public, people would avoid them, as if they carried a deadly plague. It would be hasty to blame the coldness of human hearts and the fickleness of society, for the church had gradually degenerated into a heretical cult. They stopped at nothing, constantly indoctrinating the masses with twisted doctrines. Under the name of the true God, they endlessly preached that only by absolute obedience to the church could one attain salvation and peace. This infiltration and control of thought caused the people to become completely dominated by the church spiritually. As the church's influence spread wider and became more deeply rooted in society, its power extended into every aspect of human life. Priest was once the commander of the Exorcist Corps, the most powerful combat force in the world. Yet even he was powerless in the face of such a situation. After retreating into seclusion, he could only silently endure the scornful gazes and rejection from society. Each day, aside from doing menial hard labor, he would sit in various confession booths, listening to the archbishop speak the same repeated dogma and soulless blessings. To oppose the church was to oppose God. Until one day, a sheriff named Hicks from Augustin unexpectedly came to find Priest. Hicks delivered devastating news to the legendary demon hunter. His niece had been kidnapped by vampires. Upon hearing this, Priest did not hesitate for even a moment and immediately went to the Holy See. He begged the 5 archbishops to reinstate his authority to act as an exorcist warrior. If the incident of vampires attacking civilians were to be exposed, it would cause widespread panic among the people and could even shake the rule that the church had spent years establishing. Naturally, the archbishops instantly refused and even planned to cover up the entire matter. They went so far as to threaten Priest that if he dared to leave the holy city, he would be executed on the spot. To go against the church was to go against God. A clergyman among the bishops stepped forward to plead on behalf of Priest. He wanted to use the great merits Priest once achieved to persuade the other bishops, but in the end, the final decision remained unchanged. As Priest Priest left the church, the clergyman ran after him, urging him not to do anything reckless. However, Priest had made up his mind to leave, and no one could shake his resolve to save his family. Knowing he could no longer convince Priest, the clergyman was left with no choice but to reluctantly issue the order to dispatch troops to capture him. Though it was not what he wanted, he had no other option. Ultimately, Priest broke the sacred vow he once swore to uphold, a vow he had once believed unshakable. From that moment on, Priest decided to sever all ties with the church and no longer serve them. Immediately, he turned around. As swift as lightning, Priest unleashed brutal, merciless attacks with unwavering force. In an instant, he took down all the armed soldiers behind him. Returning to his quarters, Priest once again took out the demon-hunting weapon that had accompanied him through past battles, donned his war armor, and mounted his futuristic combat motorcycle, speeding off like the wind. He left the holy city, a place once profoundly sacred but now rotten to its very core. On the road across the border, towering stone statues of the 5 high bishops could be seen piercing through the clouds. After several days without food or sleep, crossing the vast desert, Priest finally reached his destination. But Priest's older brother lay on his deathbed, breathing his last. After using his final breath to speak his dying words, Priest's brother passed away. After burying each of his loved ones one by one, Priest officially began his journey of vengeance to rescue his niece. He started preparing for the upcoming battle. Using a sharp dagger, he carved the symbol of the cross onto each bullet. But those bullets were not meant for Priest himself, because an exorcist like him had always used melee weapons. These bullets were actually prepared for Hicks. It turned out Priest had long realized that Hicks would secretly follow him, so he made preparations in advance. Priest had already engraved the bullets and arranged them neatly on the table. When Hicks entered the room, his eyes were immediately drawn to the bullets. He smiled slightly and picked one up, tossing it into the air. Instantly, a knife flew out and precisely sliced the bullet in half. With that, Hicks had passed the test and was officially accepted into Priest's team. At the same time, in the upper ranks of the Holy City, the High Council of the Church had received news of Priest's betrayal. In their eyes, such an act was a direct challenge to the authority of the Church, a crime of high treason. But the 5 high bishops immediately summoned 4 cleric hunters who had once fought side by side with Priest. All 4 were among the Church's top strategists. The Archbishop ordered that, at all costs, they must bring Priest back to face judgment, alive or dead. Meanwhile, Priest and Hicks followed traces at the scene and gradually identified the hiding place of the vampires, Mansa Reserve number 98. This place had once held countless vampire prisoners, but it had now become a paradise for the fallen. The so-called fallen were actually those abandoned by the church, exiles who had lived for years on the outer fringes without any protection. In order to survive, many had no choice but to submit to the rule of vampires and become their slaves. Once someone accepts the blood of a vampire, they become half human, half demon. These degenerates served as dinner for the vampires. Priest and Hicks tried to extract clues about Lucy from these mutated beings, but they feigned madness and refused to speak. Not wanting to waste any more time, the two proceeded toward the underground fortress prison that held the vampires. Since this place had not seen sunlight for years, the vampires had made it their nest, filling the entire area with their waste. The stench was foul and nauseating. The deeper they went, the more bloodstains they saw smeared on the doors and piles of bones stacked around. It turned out that everyone had long since been slaughtered by the vampires. At that moment, a pair of demonic eyes was quietly observing them through the crack of a cell door. Priest suddenly delivered a powerful kick that flung open the heavy steel door. He tried to interrogate the demon about his niece's whereabouts, but the creature only served the iron coffin where the vampires slept, so it knew nothing about anything else. Suddenly, a harsh metallic scraping sound echoed from outside. As the sound drew nearer, a horde of demons wielding all sorts of weapons burst out from the darkness of the tunnel. Though Hicks managed to take down one of them, his arm was slashed with a deep cut. He immediately called out to Priest for help, but there was no response. Left with no other choice, Hicks fled the fortress. However, just as he poked his head out, a demon outside swung an axe straight at him. It was only then that he realized it had all been a trap set by the enemy. They had been waiting for the two to walk right into the ambush. Cornered, Hicks quickly drew his gun, but just as he was about to pull the trigger, Priest suddenly descended from above. Because these creatures were not worth wasting silver bullets engraved with the Holy Cross, Priest deliberately spared one demon slave, intending to extract useful information from it. However, before he could ask anything, darkness quickly fell. The entire area was immediately engulfed in shadow. The bloodthirsty vampires hiding beneath the ground began to stir. One coffin after another opened up, and in the blink of an eye, numerous phantoms burst out from behind the steel doors. They had sharp fangs and wide-open mouths. Thousands of years of evolution had granted them the ability to sense the biomagnetic fields of humans. They could precisely detect the position, number, and movement direction of their prey. This allowed them to move freely and powerfully in the dark. Yet in this tense moment, Priest remained incredibly calm. He leisurely took out a Bible and began softly reciting scripture. Then he raised his hand, and 8 silver crosses rose into the air, quickly unfolding into 8 sharp blades. Before the vampires could react, Priest hurled the silver-throwing stars at an astonishing speed. The vampires struck by the blades immediately screamed in agony and were torn into fragments that scattered across the ground. Seeing the horde of vampires launching a full-scale attack, Priest was instantly caught in a fierce battle with no time to spare. Witnessing this, Hicks had no choice but to draw his gun and try to hold off the remaining vampires. However, he had overestimated his shooting ability. He hadn't expected that the vampires would be twice as fast as a speeding bullet. In the blink of an eye, they had already reached him. Just as Hicks was about to face death, Priest finally finished off the demon and saved him from the brink at the last moment. The last vampire realized it was doomed to fail. It let out 2 furious roars before turning around and fleeing into the darkness. Seeing their master abandon them, the demon slaves no longer resisted. The monster obediently revealed the whereabouts of Priest's niece. However, just as it mentioned that Lucy had been taken west, the vampire who had escaped earlier suddenly returned, clearly intending to silence the witness. Fortunately, Priest reacted with lightning speed, grabbing the vampire's ankle and forcefully dragging it to the ground. As the creature struggled, attempting to flee once more, Priest gave it no chance. He immediately sprang up and launched a jump from above, slamming down and dragging the vampire with him. Both of them crashed into the underground chamber below. Hicks, in a state of extreme tension, quickly drew his gun, his hands trembling as he aimed at the underground exit. But just as he was bracing for the worst, a familiar figure crawled out of the darkness. After the series of events they had just endured, Priest grew increasingly suspicious. His instincts told him that the Vampire Queen might be the one pulling the strings behind a vast and unprecedented conspiracy. From the fact that the Mansa Reserve, which once held 50 vampires, now had only 6 starved and emaciated ones remaining, every abnormal sign pointed to an impending crisis. Based on the information provided by the demon slave, the ancient lair west of the Sunwall could be the key to tracing the trail. That place was once one of the largest vampire strongholds, but had been destroyed during the war. It was highly likely that the remaining 44 vampires had been relocated there. In other words, if they could find the missing vampires, they would find Lucy. Therefore, the two of them followed the war-torn ruins and headed straight west. The desolate ruins around them seemed to recount the brutality of the past. Without stopping, they pressed forward, passing through the remnants of war. Soon, they arrived at the ancient lair. The lair had a strange structure, its surface covered with holes of varying sizes. The two of them clung to the dry bones embedded in the cliff face and followed the rugged path upward. Eventually, they stood before the entrance of a cave. Inside, the structure was an intricate maze. Passageways leading into chambers were stacked upon each other, forming a dense circular honeycomb. Looking down, there was only an unfathomable blackness, a vast underground kingdom shrouded in darkness. Even though no vampires were visible nearby, Priest remained highly alert. It turned out that 10 years ago, he had led a group of clerics into this very dark lair for an extremely critical purge mission. But just as they were about to reach the Vampire Queen, they were suddenly ambushed. Vampires swarmed out from the darkness in every direction and launched a deadly assault. It all happened without warning, catching the entire team off guard and causing heavy casualties. During the retreat, Priest could only watch helplessly as his closest friend slipped from his tightly grasped hand and was dragged into the dark lair by vampires. That entire tragedy stemmed from a single moment of Priest's carelessness. The mission became an enduring wound in Priest's heart. That was why this time, Priest instructed Hicks to stay put while he threw a flare deep into the lair and immediately jumped in after it. Upon landing, Priest discovered that below lay a labyrinth of intertwined pathways resembling tangled roots, making it impossible to tell which direction was which. Priest could only rely on his instincts to navigate through the darkness. At that moment, a shadow suddenly darted past his eyes and vanished into the gloom. Priest immediately gave chase. At first, he assumed the figure ahead was a vampire, but when he finally caught up and saw clearly, Priest realized it was a female cleric named Priestess who had once fought by his side. It turned out she, too, could no longer bear the oppressive rule of the church. The lofty doctrines and commands, which appeared sacred sacred and untouchable on the surface, had in truth stripped everything from her. So she made the decision to turn her back on the church, intentionally splitting off from the other 3 clerics to come find Priest alone. She came to deliver a message. As the two conversed, a sudden gunshot rang out from the direction where Hicks was stationed. They rushed over at once. Just as Priest had predicted, a vampire was still hiding in the hive. But this one was unlike any they had encountered before. The creature was massive, its muscular body towering like a moving mountain. It was clearly a high-ranking vampire. Seeing this, Priest immediately drew a silver cross-shaped throwing blade. He hurled it with all her strength toward the monster, but it only left a shallow scratch on its body, nowhere near enough to cause serious harm. At that moment, Priest lit a flare and held it high, successfully diverting the monster's attention away from her. She then used her small frame to weave through the narrow tunnels, dodging its pursuit. However, the monster's endurance far exceeded expectations. Even after crashing hard into the rock wall, it only paused for a moment before springing back to its feet. Faced with such a powerful vampire, Priest knew he had to unleash his ultimate move. He pressed his hands together, his mind as calm as still water. After taking a deep breath, he focused all his strength and charged straight toward the vampire. Understanding his intent, Priest quickly picked up 2 coffin lids from Newton on the ground and hurled them forward. Priest used them as springboards to propel himself into the air. The twin blades in his hands were already unsheathed. Mid-air, he struck directly at the vampire's vital point. The monster's massive body crashed to the ground. Priest landed flawlessly. When the dust settled, everyone realized that the so-called abandoned nest was likely just a smokescreen. The presence of a high-level vampire implied that a far greater secret was hidden here. The 3, filled with suspicion, continued exploring the damp, dark tunnels underground. Before long, Priest noticed something unusual, a passage completely different from the rest. It bore no signs of age and appeared freshly dug. They followed the tunnel deeper inside. Soon, a massive new hive revealed itself before them, its immense scale leaving them stunned. Yet there wasn't a single monster in sight. On the far side, Priest quickly sensed a faint shift in the air. Following the subtle breeze, he moved forward. Not long after, a gigantic cave mouth suddenly appeared. This entrance led directly to the Jericho Zone, the very place where the remaining 3 demon-hunting clerics had entered. At that very moment, a black military train, unrecorded in any official files, silently glided into the Jericho station like a phantom. The old guard, who was shirking his duties at the station, was suddenly awakened by the shock as the train entered the platform. He took out his pocket watch and saw that the time was exactly 11:05 at night. Feeling a bit uneasy, he grabbed his oil lamp and left his post to check the situation. After calling out several times with no response, he approached the train car to take a look inside. But in the next moment, he was torn to pieces by a vampire. Immediately after, a man wearing a watermelon hat quietly stepped onto the platform. This mysterious man commanded all the vampires on the train to flood into the residential area, turning the entire town into a living hell. On the streets, screams and explosions echoed while fires blazed sky high. The terrified townsfolk fled in all directions. Meanwhile, he listened to a requiem while enjoying the chaotic scene before him, as if conducting a symphony of apocalypse. At that moment, the last 3 demon-hunting clerics hurriedly arrived at the scene. After witnessing the horrific destruction, they could not stand by and decided to exterminate the evil. Among the 3 strongest demon hunters, the one in the middle was a bald cleric. He shouted loudly, unleashing a fierce energy. He swung his silver crescent blades, destroying countless vampires in a powerful, overwhelming flurry that seemed unstoppable. Even the common vampires dared not approach. Each move seemed capable of eradicating all evil. Yet unexpectedly, the mysterious figure lightly threw a single punch, instantly sending the bald cleric flying backward, crashing hard to the ground. The cleric tried to get up, but found his chest caved in a deep hole. At that moment, he realized his heart had been ripped out by the mysterious figure. Finally, he collapsed in a pool of blood and died in hatred. The mysterious figure then issued an ultimatum to the 2 remaining clerics: surrender or face certain death. At dawn, Priest and his 2 companions finally arrived at the Jericho area, but the scene before their eyes was one of desolation. The once bustling and prosperous town had turned into a pile of ruins. The streets were empty, with no sign of life, and the vampires had long since withdrawn. All 3 clerics had been tortured to death. Their bodies were nailed to crosses by the mysterious figure as a public humiliation and insult. Looking at the blood-stained pocket watch on the platform, Priest pondered deeply. Considering that around Jericho there was nowhere for the vampires to hide or any sanctuary for them, yet they appeared and vanished in a single night. The only way was via the railway, and the railway here led straight to the Holy City, the only transportation route in the entire region. Thinking of this, Priest suddenly awakened to the truth behind the Vampire Queen's plot. It was due to prolonged industrial pollution and environmental degradation. Above, the Holy City was covered by a dense layer of polluted matter. Sunlight could not penetrate the thick gray clouds, causing the city to remain shrouded in gloom. For the vampires, this was a once-in-a-millennium opportunity. The Queen had seen this weakness and sent the mysterious figure to kidnap Lucy to lure Priest out of the city to rescue the girl, forcing the church to send other masters to chase after him. In doing so, the Holy City's defenses would become empty, creating an opportunity for the next step in the vampires' plan. Without Priest, the strongest exorcist guarding the Holy City, the city was nothing but a defenseless lamb, easily torn apart. Time was urgent, and Priest had no time to mourn. He could only take the simplest action. He hurriedly organized a cremation ceremony for his fallen comrades as a final farewell. After the ceremony, the three set off again. They rushed at full speed across the desert like a fierce wind and thunder, then crossed rocky, rugged hills. Just as they had predicted, on the distant horizon, a black military train carrying a carriage full of vampires was speeding toward the Holy City. To stop the enemy, Priest decided to split their actions. Priest assigned Priestess to plant explosives ahead on the railway line to destroy the approaching train, while Priest rushed straight into the middle carriage to prepare for a direct confrontation with the mysterious figure wearing a melon helmet. Hicks pushed into the rear of the train to search for Lucy, forming a three-pronged attack. However, the henchmen on the train soon discovered Priestess speeding away. They immediately jumped on motorcycles and chased closely after her. Soon, they caught up and surrounded her. In a critical moment, she activated the nitrous oxide boost system. The motorcycle shot forward like an arrow from a bow, leaving the pursuers behind. At this time, Hicks pushed open the steel door at the last carriage, and a cold blast of air rushed out. Countless embryos, like frozen seeds, hung upside down in the air. They slowly stirred in the nourishing fluid, as if ready to break out of their cocoons at any moment. Just then, as Priest jumped onto the carriage, the motorcycle was suddenly thrown off and crashed violently into the side of the train, causing a fierce explosion. The shock made Hicks lose his balance and accidentally touch an embryo. The entire line triggered a chain reaction, awakening all the dormant embryos. Priest had no idea at all. As he climbed onto the roof of the train and looked up, the figure before him stunned him. Unexpectedly, the kidnapper of Lucy was none other than his longtime friend, Black Hat. It turned out that years ago, after Black Hat was drawn into the demon's lair, he received the queen vampire's blood and became a completely new species, surpassing both vampire hunters and vampires, a hybrid species between humans and vampires. His betrayal of humanity and the church was because he felt that the vampire's soul was purer. In his eyes, vampires were driven by survival instincts and free from the complex ethics of humans. They cared only about survival and made no distinction between good and evil. Conversely, the human soul was bound by morality, law, and the chains of emotion. Humans constantly struggled between bottomless desire and moral standards. Therefore, he believed the human soul was not pure, but full of hypocrisy. They always hid personal desires behind the name of morality. Thus, he decided to overthrow the church and assist the queen in reclaiming power to establish a new order ruled by vampires. The ideological conflict between them quickly escalated into an unavoidable battle. Both bodies leapt into the air simultaneously and launched their attacks. However, with the queen's blood flowing through him, Black Hat had long since transformed into a superior being. His abilities far surpassed Priest's. Meanwhile, Priestess had successfully planted the bomb on the railway line. Everything was ready, just waiting for the bomb to start the final countdown, which would destroy the track completely. But just as she was about to return to the combat vehicle to support Priest and Hicks, the demon servants suddenly launched another relentless attack. Facing the rapidly approaching enemies, she calmly clasped her hands together. It seemed as if everything around her was irrelevant. When the enemies came close, she suddenly opened her eyes and leapt up. First was a powerful kick that sent one enemy flying. Immediately after, her body slid quickly, easily dodging the charging foes. At the same time, she picked up a weapon from the ground, spun around, and slashed another enemy. Finally, Priestess drew a rope with a metal ball attached to the end. Under her skilled control, the rope whipped forward, striking and freezing the enemy's hand before they could react. In less than 2 minutes, she had dealt with all the monsters without a scratch. Unfortunately, while she was distracted, the demon servants had already destroyed the timer bomb. To ensure the plan could proceed smoothly, she decided to take a risk. Meanwhile, the battle between Priest and Black Hat was reaching its most intense phase. To be exact, Priest was at a disadvantage. Despite drawing his knife and swinging, he couldn't land a hit on his opponent. Conversely, Black Hat only needed an elbow strike to send Priest flying. Then he suddenly jumped up. His two fists, carrying terrifying power, slammed down hard. Priest barely managed to avoid this powerful blow, but could not withstand the following attacks. This was his last chance. Black Hat tried to tempt Priest to side with the Queen. Gathering all his strength, Black Hat unleashed his final punch. The force of the blow sent Priest flying off the vehicle. From that height, it was certain Priest would die. Black Hat stood at the edge of the vehicle, watching the direction where Priest disappeared. His face showed no joy of victory. On the other side, Hicks was still moving through the vampire egg chamber. Suddenly, a fully grown vampire fell from above. Hicks quickly drew his gun to fight back, but the gunfire disturbed the vampire larvae. Accompanied by cracking sounds, the vampire larvae began breaking out of their eggs one after another. The scene was terrifying. Hicks hurriedly turned and fled to the next car. He drove a dagger firmly into the steel door to block the pursuing vampires. When he looked back, he saw Lucy right before him, but she was being dragged by demon servants toward the next car. Hicks immediately drew his pistol, preparing to break the door open, when Priest suddenly crawled up from the bottom of the car. Although breathing heavily, it was clear he was still alive. Before they could speak, the vampire army crashed into the steel door and poured in. At this critical moment, Hicks shot down the first vampire charging forward with his pistol. Then he fired 3 shots into the ceiling. Sunlight immediately shone down, forming a barrier that stopped all vampires. Taking advantage of this, the two quickly passed through one car, then another containing vampire embryos. Finally, they found the room where Lucy was held. But just then, Black Hat suddenly attacked from above. Seeing this, Lucy used the chaos to break free from control, quickly grabbing an oil lamp and throwing it at a demon servant. Then she pulled out a dagger hidden on her and stabbed toward Black Hat. It turned out Lucy was not Priest's niece but his biological daughter. Black Hat slapped Lucy, causing her to fall to the ground, then turned and pushed Priest, who was rushing forward, against the wall. The intense pain immediately spread throughout Priest's body. His vision darkened, and he lost consciousness. Black Hat intended to let him perish in the flames, ending all grudges completely. Then Black Hat quickly jumped out the door, carrying Lucy with him. The train was about to crash into the city wall of the Holy City. At the current speed, even destroying the tracks might be too late. The train's momentum was too great. Even if the tracks were destroyed, it could still barrel into the city thanks to its massive kinetic energy. Priestess decided to risk everything for one final move. She strapped all the explosives onto the war chariot and sent it charging at full speed toward the train, detonating the explosives on impact and completely destroying all the cars. Meanwhile, Priest was still unconscious. He seemed to hear the whisper of God. The sound echoed in his ears little by little, awakening his consciousness. Although he had once betrayed his oath, deep within his soul, his faith had never wavered. Gritting his teeth, Priest endured the pain and forced himself to pull out the dagger deeply embedded in his shoulder. By then, the train tracks were less than 100 meters from the Holy City. Black Hat's plan was about to succeed. He was preparing to turn Lucy into his own kind. Just as his fangs were about to pierce her neck, Priest timely threw a silver cross at him. Just as Black Hat prepared to finish Priest off, a sound came from the distance. Priestess appeared far away. She rushed forward at extreme speed. When less than 100 meters from the locomotive, she suddenly accelerated, ready to face the enemy in a final showdown. Seeing this, Priest immediately summoned all his strength, holding his daughter tightly in his arms. As the two vehicles collided, he immediately released and leapt off the train, still clutching his daughter. The explosion roared like thunder, shaking the earth and reducing everything to ashes. Black Hat also vanished in the sea of flames, dissolving into nothingness. The entire train was left completely exposed under the sunlight, with nothing left to shield it. Even if a vampire survived, it could not escape the burning flames and blazing sunlight. Under the judgment of the light, everything finally fell into silence. Hicks was thrown off the train car. The demon's motorcycle sped straight toward the battlefield. Fortunately, Priest's physique was very strong. Protected by Priest, Lucy remained safe and unharmed. Since joining the church and becoming a demon hunter, he had understood clearly that choosing this path meant great sacrifice. But for a greater justice, he had to give up his small family. Therefore, he entrusted his wife and child to his elder brother's care. However, now that his brother had passed away, he was no longer bound by the church. Priest could finally lay down his burdens and return to his family to make up for past regrets. As the black smoke gradually faded, Priestess also stepped out from the explosion's aftermath. She was still alive. The people of the holy city had no idea about the disaster that nearly struck them. They still sat reverently in the church, listening to the bishop's sermons, completely unaware that a massive crisis had just passed right beside them. Priestess carried a sack and went straight into the church. The bishop's sermon was immediately interrupted. In the stunned eyes of everyone, Priest took out from the sack a freshly severed vampire head and threw it directly before the Pope. The entire church erupted into chaos. He told them to go to the burning train outside Marseille, where they would see hundreds of vampire killers and the queen still frantically reproducing. Priestess tried to persuade the fake archbishop. Priest told him that a great battle concerning the survival of all humanity was about to break out. But the archbishop's eyes had long been blinded by power. His thinking remained stuck in the post-war era. He believed the holy city was solid and impregnable, completely unafraid of any threat. He also refused to accept the truth that the vampires had returned with greater power than before. Faced with the church's decay and the indifference of the people of the holy city, Priest, who had devoted himself wholeheartedly, turned away in disappointment. But he had not yet given up. Leaving the city, Priest met with Priestess outside. They decided to split up and travel to other holy cities to spread the news and prepare for battle. They recruited all demon hunters willing to fight together and made thorough preparations to confront the approaching vampire army. This is the end of the entire movie. Above is the full content of this film. Thank you for following until the end. See you all in the next episode.